Okay. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. I am Kevin Torresiano, the chair of the UCLA History Department, and this is our event, Why History Matters. The Department of History has been doing Why History Matter programs since 2011. We've done about 30 of them. And these are public-facing discussions of issues of great concern to us today and their historical context. We want to emphasize the importance of knowing the past in order to understand the present, and the idea that history can help us make informed choices in the future. Like the lyrics to that famous song, if you don't know your history, you won't know where you're coming from. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on a really important issue in the United States and in the Americas, the issue of gun violence. And we have three experts from history, from law, and public health here with us to lead this discussion. So first, let me introduce Professor Brian DeLay, who is a professor of history and Preston Hotchkiss Chair in the History of the United States at UC Berkeley. He is the author of War of a Thousand Deserts, Indian Raids, and the U.S.-Mexican War, and is now completing a book called Aim at Empire about the international arms trade in the age of revolution. He frequently serves as an expert witness in federal court cases involving the Second Amendment and has a long article forthcoming in the California Law Review entitled The Myth of Continuity in American Gun Culture. Second is Professor Adam Winkler, Connell Professor of Law at UCLA. He's the author of Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America, and We the Corporations, How American Businesses Won Their Civil Rights. He's a specialist on American constitutional law, the Supreme Court, and gun policy. And third, Jennifer Wagman is Associate Professor of Community Health Sciences at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. Her scholarship addresses violence, including gun violence, as a public health issue. She is the principal investigator of two gun violence prevention research studies. One focuses on reducing intimate partner homicide in Los Angeles by screening for exposure to firearms in violent relationships. The second aims to assess the use of extreme risk protection orders in cases of intimate partner violence in California. We had a fourth panelist, Wilson Hammett, but she cannot make it, and so she has given her talking points generously to Professor Wagman. Wilson Hammett is a PhD candidate in UCLA Fielding School of Public Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management. So before I pass it on to our experts here, I'd like to just say a few words about the topic. When it comes to gun violence, the United States is one of the most violent places in the world. According to the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington School of Medicine, the United States has the highest level of firearm homicides among high-income nations with a population of more than 2 million. If you look at the Gun Violence Archive, in 2023, last year, there were 656 mass shootings in the United States. There were nearly 20,000 deaths related to gun violence, almost 40,000 injuries. Children and teens killed and injured are about 6,000 in just that year. And if you look at every single year that the Gun Violence Archive documents, it's much the same. Of course, many Americans own guns because they hunt or claim to need them to defend themselves, but in reality, only a very small percentage of gun-related homicides result from hunting or self-defense. According to the same archive, there are more unintentional shootings and homicides than there is defensive gun use. And there is ample evidence in the United States and worldwide that shows a direct correlation between gun control laws and a decrease in gun-related homicides. The United Kingdom suffered a mass shooting in 1996 in Scotland, and the House of Commons immediately passed sweeping gun control laws. And there has not been a single incident like it in the UK since then. In contrast, since the temporary 10-year ban on assault weapons in the United States was lifted in 2004, a law promoted by California Senator Dianne Feinstein, mass murders with those weapons have risen dramatically. And yet federal judges strike down California laws that try to address the problem. Most recently, in May 2022, the Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruled by a vote of 2-1 that California had violated the Second Amendment with its law prohibiting the sale of semi-automatic weapons to people under the age of 21. Former President Trump appointed the two judges that struck down the California law. One of them said, quote, "America would not exist without the heroism of the young adults who fought and died in our Revolutionary Army." Ryan Nelson. He said, "Today, we reaffirm that our Constitution still protects the right that enable their sacrifice, the right of young adults to keep and bear arms." Judge Nelson compared the AR-15 to a Swiss Army knife. As a historian, I'm appalled by such casual, anachronistic uses of history by a federal judge. I turn now to my colleague from UC Berkeley to discuss the historical context of gun culture and violence in the United States. Professor DeLay.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Can everybody hear me back there? Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, all of you, for coming tonight to talk about this important issue. It's an honor to be here with my co-panelists. As Kevin said, I have, over the last couple of years, become an expert witness in a number of different Second Amendment cases in states across the country. And those cases are always about some specific issue, but there's a kind of higher level of abstraction that the cases always unfold over, and that is the bare fact that the founders didn't do much in terms of gun regulation. And so, in different ways, these cases are asking the really important question: why didn't they do much about gun regulation? My colleagues on the other side of these cases, the plaintiffs and their expert witnesses, generally say something like, well, sure, guns are different today than they were then, but they're not that different, and the issues provoked by guns are not that different. And therefore, the failure of the founders to meaningfully regulate these firearms was because of an ideological commitment to not regulating firearms. As a historian, I'm constantly saying the opposite. I'm constantly saying, in fact, guns and the problems caused by guns were powerfully different in the founding era than they are today. And those differences are critical for us to be able to properly understand why the founders did or did not do something about guns. So what I'd like to do in my opening comments here is I'd like to just share with you what I regard as three of the most important differences between gun culture at the founding and gun culture in our own time. Before I do that, though, I want to acknowledge one really important similarity, one very important continuity, and that was that early Americans, British North Americans in the 13 colonies in the lead up to the American Revolution, this was a heavily armed society by the standards of the day. There were a lot of firearms in early America. The best research on this question has concluded that in around 1774, on average, about half of white households in the 13 colonies possessed at least one firearm, usually only one firearm. That works out to be probably enough guns in private hands to equip about a third of all adult white men in the colonies at the time. This is, again, right on the eve of the American Revolution. And by the standards of the day, that's a lot of guns. When we're thinking about other colonial regions in the Americas, and certainly when we're thinking about European countries, that's a lot of guns. The question is, why were they so well armed? And once we start inquiring into that question, why were British and North Americans so well armed, much like Americans are incredibly well armed today, then I think the argument for continuity really begins to break down. So that's what I want to start with here. Early American society was well armed because it was a war-making society. That's really maybe the single most important thing I have to share with you tonight. Early America was well armed because it was a war-making society. British North America was preoccupied with three basic kinds of conflicts: settler colonialism, slavery, and inter-imperial war. And these connected and ran into each other in ways that magnified the opportunities and the challenges of all these different kinds of war making. The first two conflicts, settler colonialism and slavery, were foundational to the entire enterprise of early America, what early America was. Without a weapons gap, it would not have been possible to displace Native people from their land. And without displacing Native people from their land, there is no colonization. Without a weapons gap, it would not be possible to keep hundreds of thousands of people enslaved. A fifth of the population on the eve of the American Revolution. That required an arsenal to make possible. And so both of those factors, settler colonialism and slavery, magnified by periodic bouts of inter-imperial warfare fought in North America, those are the reasons that British North America was heavily armed compared to other societies at the time. Crucially, the state at the time did not have the capacity to manage and execute these conflicts on its own, right? There was either no standing army or only a very small standing army prior to the American Revolution in North America. And that means that when it came to fighting Native people, to keeping people of African descent enslaved, and for fighting these periodic wars against imperial rivals, adult white men elsewhere in the economy and in the colonies had to be recruited to fight these wars. And they were either drafted or they volunteered, usually in militias, and they generally brought their own arms with them. They were expected to have their own arms in ways I'm going to talk about in just a second. So this basic fact, that early America was a wartime project that required a heavily armed white population, this helps explain the three biggest differences that I see between our own times and the late 18th century, the founding era. The first was that while our gun culture is consumerist, theirs was utilitarian. Today, guns are heavily marketed consumer goods. If you go to I don't know how it is in LA, but at least in the Bay Area, even in the liberal Bay Area, you go to the grocery store and a good fifth or sixth of the magazine rack is dedicated to firearms magazines. These are guns are coming in an absolutely dizzying variety, and firearms manufacturers are very, very adept at targeting new and emerging, increasingly sort of small segments of this gigantic market. About 3% of the US population owns 17 or more firearms. The study that came up with this figure dubbed these owners so-called super owners. And together they possess something around half of all privately held firearms in the country. Nothing remotely like this existed in early America, not even close. Few households possessed more than one gun, and very few possessed as many as 5. Vanishingly few possessed more than 5. And almost all of the ones that did possess more than 5 were elite white households in the South that ran major slave operations, right? So these are families that have an extremely obvious utilitarian reason for needing to be heavily armed. Most British North Americans saw guns as tools, in other words, and they would have found our hyper-commercialized, ideologically charged culture of consuming and collecting and stockpiling arms deeply alien. The second big difference that I see is that where our gun culture is individualist, theirs was collective. Since 2008, the Supreme Court's position has been that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to armed self-defense. And of course, this is something that many, many Americans feel very deeply about. Gun rights groups have put the armed individual at the center of their rhetoric for a long time now. And the firearms industry has been phenomenally successful at marketing not only fear, but I think also the promise or the prospect that the armed individual, the virtuous armed individual, will be able to protect not only themselves, but the people that they love. It's a very seductive and powerful and successful message. Again, things were very different in the founding era. Prior to the widespread availability of breech-loading weapons and metallic cartridges, which doesn't happen until the mid-19th century, firearms were really awkward tools for either perpetrating or resisting crimes of passion. They were notoriously inaccurate at range. They were notoriously prone to misfire. And they had to be laboriously loaded with powder and ball from the muzzle every time the shooter wanted to fire off a round. That took time and focus. Moreover, it was unusual to keep a weapon loaded and at the ready for any length of time because of the way that black powder corroded iron barrels. So that just wasn't something that was done all that often. Partly for these reasons, firearms usually played a relatively small role in homicides between white people in the 13 colonies or even in the early republic, basically until the Civil War. What preoccupied white gun owners, which is another way of saying the overwhelming majority of gun owners in the 13 colonies, was not self-defense so much as collective offense. It's a really important difference, I think. The three kinds of collective war-making that made guns so important and abundant in the 18th century, that's what preoccupied American gun owners in the early period. Third and finally, the third big difference that I want to share with you tonight is that while our gun culture is state-phobic, theirs was state-led. Another big and important and consequential difference. Fear of the state has been almost as useful for the gun rights movement and for the firearms industry as a marketing tool as has fear of crime and the prospect of self-defense. Nearly every election is framed as an existential contest over the future of gun rights in this country. And every proposed gun regulation is framed as a step on the slippery slope toward state confiscation. The public responds to these kinds of messages very powerfully. Sales of certain kinds of guns and accessories surge after mass shootings because of the anticipation of regulation or the supposed anticipation of regulation. And presidential elections can have massive consequences for the civilian arms market, even though the prospect of meaningful gun reform in this country is so tiny regardless of who actually has control of the presidency. So here again, things were fundamentally different in the founding era. British colonists were unusually well armed because they were perpetually at war. They fought those wars collectively in militias. And these militias were organized, disciplined, directed, and very often armed by the state. There were, in fact, hundreds of firearms regulations in the colonial period. It's just that most of them took the form of militia laws, and what most of these militia laws did, among other things, is they mandated firearms ownership by white male colonists. When militiamen weren't able to come to service with their own firearm, the state generally provided one for them. So the state was so important to this gun culture, so important to arming early America, that you can more or less predict rates of gun ownership in the 13 colonies based on the kinds of militia laws that those colonies passed. It's an extremely powerful effect. So all this to say is that as a historian, I find these differences in gun culture today and in the founding era really fascinating. I hope that you think they're at least a little bit interesting as well. But as a citizen, I have to say, I feel highly ambivalent about the fact that this is relevant to whether or not we can have firearms regulation in our cities and in our state and in the country. And that's something that's really up to the Supreme Court. And that's how I'm going to hand this off to Adam.
Thank you very much, and thanks for Kevin and the organizers for having us here, and for all of you for showing up, because it would just be a Zoom conversation among the four of us if you weren't here. So it's good that you're here. So why history matters? Well, history matters in the context of the Second Amendment and gun policy in America to a great extent. And the reason why is because the Supreme Court has said that history really matters here. In fact, the court has said that history itself will be determinative of whether a gun policy and a gun law is constitutionally permissible or not. In 2022, the Supreme Court held in a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin that the Second Amendment protects a right to possess firearms on public streets. And the court struck down a law in New York that made it very difficult to get a permit to carry a concealed firearm. And while that decision was important for what it said about public safety in New York and gun carrying on the streets, perhaps even more important for gun policy writ large was the court's adoption of a new test for how to decide whether a gun law is constitutionally permissible under the Second Amendment and whether it's not. Everyone agrees that the Second Amendment, or at least everyone on the court for the most part agrees that the Second Amendment probably protects some individual right to have firearms to some extent, but there are real questions over what laws are constitutionally permissible and what laws are not. And the court in the Bruin case said the way that we should determine that the answer to that question is by looking at what the court said was text, history, and tradition. Look to see whether the behavior, the conduct involved that's regulated by the government is within the text of the Second Amendment. Well, that step doesn't get you very far because the amendment itself is pretty short. It doesn't have a lot of details. It doesn't tell us whether there's a right to concealed firearms. It doesn't tell us whether there's a right for people between the ages of 18 to 21 to carry firearms, or what types of firearms are protected by that idea of a right to keep and bear arms. So the court said, in the absence of clear textual provision, then you turn to history and tradition and to see what were the historical patterns of gun regulation in early America. And the court said, the periods to look to are the 1780s and 1790s, up until the end of the 1800s. Now you might say, well, why this time period? Well, the court is currently dominated by justices who consider themselves originalists. And by that, they mean that the only appropriate way to interpret the Constitution, with all its ambiguities, is by looking to the original public understanding of that amendment when it was adopted. What did the people think it did? And the court says, well, when it comes to gun rights, we're interested in the original public understanding of the Second Amendment, adopted as part of the original Bill of Rights, 1791, and also the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, the 14th Amendment was adopted after the Civil War, 1868, and one of the things that the framers of the 14th Amendment intended to do was to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. Originally, the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government for nuances of constitutional law, but 14th Amendment expanded it to the states. So the court said, well, we're interested in how the framers understood the expansion of the Second Amendment to the states in the 1860s. And Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas, who wrote the Supreme Court's opinion in the Bruin case, said when we get to about 1900, that the laws before 1900 speak to the understanding of the public of what was permissible gun regulation and what wasn't gun regulation at the time of the Second Amendment and the time of the 14th Amendment. And the court said, but once you get past about 1900, the court said, what happens is not very indicative of the original public understanding, because we're moving too far away from these amendments and the time that they were adopted. And in essence, what that means is that for a gun law to be constitutionally permissible today means it must have some analog or historical precedent in the 17 and 1800s. If governments did not regulate guns in the way that we're trying to regulate them today, back in the 17 and 1800s, then it's most likely that that law is unconstitutional and exceeds government's authority to regulate firearms under the Second Amendment. Now, this was a highly problematic approach to thinking about constitutional issues. You should know that I've been teaching constitutional law for 20 years. There's not a single right in the Constitution that we teach as being determined by history and tradition alone. History and tradition always matters for constitutional law, but it's never been determinative of what laws can be adopted or what cannot. Typically, what the Supreme Court says the Constitution requires is the notion that no right is completely absolute, and if the government has sufficiently strong reasons and the law is sufficiently well designed and narrowly tailored, then the government can restrict your rights sometimes. It can prohibit you from falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater, even though you might think that's your free speech right, because the government has sufficiently strong reasons, avoiding a stampede, and the law is narrowly tailored. It doesn't say you can't shout in a theater. It says you can't shout something that will cause mayhem and cause the problem. The court rejects that view and says, no, we're only going to look at history and tradition. And part of the reason why this is so problematic is, number one, the core of American gun laws today are very different from the gun laws that we had in the 17 and 1800s. We had some gun laws in the 17 and 1800s. We banned African Americans from possessing firearms in a lot of states, banned African Americans from carrying firearms in other states. That's not the kind of law that provides us much help in how we think about gun policy today, because obviously we can't ban people on the basis of race from possessing firearms or carrying them on the public streets. If we think about things like background checks for gun purchases, well, obviously we didn't have any background checks in the 17 and 1800s. There was no such institutional capacity to have background checks. And indeed today we ban, and most people think it's a good idea, to ban felons and people who have been deemed mentally incompetent, and people who are dishonorably discharged or have been ordered to be restrained from having firearms as a result of a domestic violence incident. All of those are examples of people who are prohibited from having firearms today that are very mainstream laws. But it's hard, there were no laws that did those things in the 17 and 1800s. Felons were not banned from possessing firearms until the 1930s. People who are mentally ill were not banned from possessing firearms until the 1960s. Domestic abusers were not banned from possessing firearms until the 1990s. Background checks were not adopted at the federal level and at the state level really until the 1980s, and at the federal level in the 1990s. So the core of American gun laws don't really seem supported by the history and tradition of the laws of the 17 and 1800s. And indeed, the court in Bruin itself kind of undermined its own approach. The court said, well, in the Bruin case, well, we're striking down this New York gun law, but we are going to say that states can have shall issue permitting for concealed carry. In other words, you can require people to get some modicum of training, learn how to use a firearm, and as long as they're a law-abiding person, they can get a permit to have a firearm. But there's no such law like that in the 17 or 1800s. So as a result, what the courts are doing today the courts are trying to figure out, are there analogies in the historical record to the gun laws that we have today? And how do we draw those analogies when the gun laws that we had were so fundamentally different from the kinds of gun laws that we have today? This is really highlighted by a case that's currently pending before the United States Supreme Court. We should have a decision in this case by June. It's a case called United States versus Rahimi. And at issue in that case is whether someone who is subject to a restraining order in a domestic violence case can possess firearms under the Second Amendment. There's a federal law that says they can't. And that law was challenged in court by someone who was under one of these restraining orders, someone who had used firearms inappropriately on half a dozen occasions. A lower court struck that law down and said, look, when we look at history and tradition, there's no history of restraining orders in the 17 and 1800s. We had no such thing as a restraining order. And we didn't really ban domestic abusers from possessing firearms in the 17 and 1800s. Absolutely factually true. In fact, we sometimes welcomed domestic abusers rather than punish them. And so this case has now come up before the Supreme Court, and it's really sort of, I went to the oral argument in that case, it was in November, and it was really laying bare the difficulties of this history and tradition approach. Justices were really bewildered. Well, we have to apply this text and history approach, but there really isn't much in text and history that's very similar to this. So how do we draw some kind of analogy here and say this is like the gun laws of yesterday? This has proven to be a task very difficult for the lower courts. One reason why the court said we're going to apply this history and tradition approach rather than the sort of traditional, does the government have sufficiently strong reasons and is the law narrowly tailored kind of approach, was because the court said that's too subjective, that other approach. Letting judges decide whether government has sufficiently good reasons, that's, empowering judges and sort of freeing up judges to impose their own vision of the world on the Constitution rather than letting history and tradition decide these. History and tradition, the court said, would be more objective, less subjective. But that's proven not to be the case in the lower courts. The lower courts, applying this history and tradition test over the last 2 years, have struck down dozens of laws. At the same time, almost all the laws that have been struck down have been upheld by other courts applying the exact same test. So we have courts in some circuits saying that restrictions on handguns for 18 to 21-year-olds is unconstitutional because we had no such restrictions in the 17 and 1800s. Other courts are saying, no, that's constitutionally permissible. Other courts have said that bans on felons possessing firearms are unconstitutional, whereas other courts have said that's perfectly constitutional. And indeed, I could list you 12 more examples of just where courts have gone completely different directions on the exact same issue, applying the exact same test, trying to incorporate the exact same historical testimony and historical evidence that have been offered in these cases. So it hasn't really proven... Was that the signal that I was supposed to shut up? When you get a law professor up here, you need a signal, okay? You need that. So it hasn't really proven less subjective, and what's going to be really interesting to see what happens in this Supreme Court case. One possibility is that the court will agree with the lower court and say, yeah, this ban is unconstitutional. We didn't have bans on domestic abusers possessing firearms. We didn't have bans on people subject to a restraining order back in the 17 and 1800s, so we can't have it today. It seemed from the oral argument, however, that there was a strong majority of justices that were inclined to uphold this law, this federal ban. And if that holds true, it's going to be very interesting to see how they can reason their way to that argument. There's a real easy way to do it. Government has really good reasons for banning domestic abusers from possessing firearms. They're the most dangerous demographic of people you can have with firearms in America. And a law that bans firearms for domestic abusers who've been subject to a restraining order found by a court to be violent and to be a danger, well, that's pretty narrowly tailored. That law would survive under the old approach. But we're not using that. Now we're looking at text and history. And if the court is going to uphold this law, it's going to have to say that when we look at history, we have to look at it at a very high level of generality. Because we don't have domestic abuser bans, we don't have restraining order bans. So for those things to be permissible, we're going to have to frame the historical evidence at a very high level of generality. Like, well, we banned some dangerous people from possessing firearms. Like, at the time, African Americans were thought to be dangerous for reasons of slave revolts and whatnot, or undermining white supremacy. But that seems like a very difficult argument to swallow as well. So keep your eyes out for what happens in June. There is no doubt going forward that gun policy will be heavily influenced by the court's understanding of the history and tradition of gun regulation. The question is whether the court is going to make that an inquiry that debilitates government and makes it impossible to regulate firearms in only just the most extraordinary circumstances, or will be one that will empower courts to frame things at a very high level of generality, in which case one might genuinely wonder, how much work is history really doing? Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you. This is gun policy is not only a really compelling legal and historical issue, it's a public health issue. One might even call it an epidemic. This is the area of expertise of Professor Jennifer Wagman.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Oh, can you hear me? Yeah. I'd like to echo the gratitude for the invitation to be here tonight. And it's so nice to see this room filled, particularly when I know this isn't the most uplifting topic in the world. But I'm going to try to do my best to follow up on what we've heard about the historical perspective of guns and some of the legal aspects. And as noted, I am in the field of public health, and I feel like thanks to COVID-19, many more people in the world know what public health means. That is, with the exception of my parents. They still have no idea what I do, but that's another story. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to address violence overall, and specifically gun violence, from a public health perspective. And from a historical lens, it's actually only relatively recently that we've even considered violence to be something that should be addressed as a public health epidemic. As mentioned, it's typically considered something that's handled within the field of criminal justice or law, or even sociology, understanding, anthropological understandings of violent behaviors. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what is being done from the perspective of public health, which overlaps quite a bit with medicine and healthcare. But what big distinction is that we are very much focusing on prevention. And from a perspective of understanding gun violence, we're really interested in understanding what are all of the multifaceted issues that are contributing to people's behaviors? Because, you often hear this saying of, guns don't kill people. It's people who kill people, which is such a silly statement. But going off of that, it's actually, we will say, well, then we're going to figure out what people are doing with the guns. And that's exactly what we try to do from public health, is trying to understand what contributes to violent behaviors. With the exception of mental health illnesses or personality disorders, we generally agree that violent behavior is something that is learned and something that is developed over the course of an individual's life. That is not to suggest at all that it's just a simple lesson that someone picks up. That is very much distant from what the reality is. We know that there are multiple factors across people's lives that contribute to violent behavior and experiences of trauma. So from a public health perspective, we're really trying to understand, what are those issues? What are the ways in which we can identify at what level they exist? And more specifically, how can we intervene to try to address these issues, mitigate violence, including gun violence, and also to prevent it ultimately? So we know, we've already heard, that gun violence is a huge issue in the United States. A big issue from public health, too, is that we try to understand what the magnitude of the problem is, both in terms of mortality, so death and injury and illness. One of the issues that also brings in history is that We don't have a lot of data. Everything in science is evidence-based, and that is a huge gap in our field of scientific literature currently in the United States and globally, is that we don't have a whole lot of data. The database is increasing. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more actually in terms of one of the biggest challenges related to addressing violence is that gun violence in particular, is that we haven't had federal support consistently to support gun violence research. And I think that is by design. But just so giving that little bit of background on public health, I wanted to talk about some of the statistics that we know. We've already heard some of them. This is a big deal when it comes to what we do in terms of research, also in terms of education and awareness raising. A lot of people don't really recognize the magnitude of the problem. We've already heard that in the United States, we have the highest rate of gun ownership. And although the United States is only making up 4% of the world's population, it accounts for 35% of the global firearm suicides. Americans are 25 times more likely to be killed in a gun homicide than individuals in all other high-income countries. So we heard the case of England having one incident of gun violence related death, and then the policies changed. That has been the case in many other countries, such as New Zealand, other European countries, but the United States does not follow that pattern. Over the past decade, more than 1 million Americans have been shot. Gun violence rates are climbing. They're going up. We saw a huge spike surrounding the COVID pandemic. And the highest level of gun deaths in our recorded history was in 2021, with just under 50,000 deaths in the United States alone. Firearms are involved in almost 2/3 of suicide deaths in the United States. Gun-related suicides are the overwhelming majority of gun-related deaths, which is something that is typically unknown. People think it's related more to homicides, but it is mostly suicide cases, and that kind of spans the United States too. We know that gun use is different depending on geographic location, whether we're talking about an urban cosmopolitan setting or a more rural area where people have more guns for hunting purposes, or so that is reported. We know that the gun-related crisis, if you will, disproportionately impacts minoritized populations. So I wanted to state that although all of us here are white individuals, this is something that is a huge issue, a health disparity and a social disparity in the field of violence in general, and including gun violence. We've heard that firearms are a huge issue when it comes to the welfare of children and adolescents. Currently in the US, firearms are the number one cause of death among children and adolescents. And this is only exacerbated by the current mental health crisis that we have in the United States with young people. So I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail about two priority populations. One is children. We know that in addition to firearms being the leading cause of homicide among youth, they also are one of the highest causes of injury, primarily unintended injury, among young children as young as toddler ages. So this is something too that can completely be prevented from removing access to guns and firearms. But I'm sure we've all heard about issues related to firearm storage and preventing children from getting access to guns. And in the most recent case, we've heard of parents actually purchasing guns for their children when they're in middle school or high school. The rate of suicide among children and adolescents has significantly increased over the past 10 years, and that is highly attributed to access to guns and other firearms. Something I want to state too is that in addition to the overall state of violence in the United States, gun-related deaths and injuries among children are predominantly impacting children of Black and brown children, children who are in low economic situations, so minoritized populations, which again is highlighting a huge disparity in the country. And I feel it also is one reason that we often don't take as much time to actually focus on this issue, because it's often considered that is, we've heard about regulations preventing Black or African American populations from even owning guns in the past. This is something that's really critically important too from a public health perspective, is understanding that those trends are changing, but this is very much a racist problem as well in our country. We've heard also about gun violence and domestic violence, and confession is that I do not consider myself a gun violence expert. My field of work is actually in the field of intimate partner violence prevention. This is a huge, we've already heard from Dr. Winkler too, that domestic violence abusers who have access to or ownership of guns are one of, if not the most high-risk population in our country. We know in the United States that people who are in violent relationships as survivors or victims of violence are 5 times more likely to be murdered by their partner if their partner has access to a gun. And that doesn't necessarily mean if they own their own gun, it's only if they can get access to a gun. And that even includes the case of if a survivor purchases a gun or other firearm for self-protection, that is significantly more likely that that gun will be used to result in injury of the victim or survivor. So we've heard too that there are protection orders in place that should theoretically offer protection to survivors of gun violence. Those are domestic violence protection orders or emergency risk protection orders, which are also known as red flag laws, or gun violence protection orders. These, we are very lucky to live in the state of California, has some of, if not the most progressive gun laws in the United States. However, and we do have protection orders in place. However, a huge gap in our system is knowing how to enforce these protection orders and knowing how to actually understand when, so many of the survivors who would otherwise have protections to protect them from being severely injured or killed by a partner, oftentimes they don't understand what their rights are or what the access is to these types of protections that are in place. So this, I will say, is some of the work that I am doing and trying to better understand how we can improve the efficacy of protection orders that are in place in the state of California and encourage other state legislators to adopt these issues. So as I mentioned, there are lots of disparities when it comes to the burden that falls on individuals when we're thinking about gun-related illness, injury, and fatalities. Another issue is related to the protections that are theoretically in place to help people escape from violent relationships or prevent themselves from being harmed or killed. But we know that these protections are not evenly spread across our population, including in the state of California. What I mean by that is that our minoritized populations are less likely to be offered legal services, support services, counseling services that will offer them education about the way in which they can secure a gun violence restraining order, for example. So this is something that we need to do a lot better in, and this is a big effort in the field of public health and what we're trying to kind of elevate and get a lot more done. So in the last few minutes of my talk, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what we are doing in the field of public health to try to address these issues. One of the biggest things that we do is in the field of research, so is trying to collect data. There are a lot of myths pertaining to the magnitude of the problem when it comes to gun violence, and one of the best, if not the only way that we can address that is with information and facts. So this is a big area of public health right now, is conducting population-based research to get a better sense of what is the scope of the problem, what are the risk factors, who are the populations most impacted, and then using that data to inform the interventions that are offered. A lot of the interventions that are in place right now are new, so we don't know how well they actually work. To give you a sense of some of the programs that are being done towards prevention, a lot of work that's done at the community, so community-based interventions, such as working with community-based organizations to try to have people on the ground who will actually work with people in the community. There's often a lot more trust when people are invited to work with people that they know amongst themselves. Legislation and policy are obviously quite critical and important, and we've heard a lot about that already from our legal and historical experts. Education and awareness, something I want to note too, is the reason I actually came to UCLA was to join the Fielding School of Public Health, to start doing classes, teaching, to bring up the next generation of public health practitioners who would start working on these issues, specifically on violence and gun violence as public health issues, who can go out and do the work on prevention. But the majority of public health schools don't actually address violence as a public health issue. Most of our clinicians are not trained on how to address gun violence unless they're in a trauma ward or in an emergency room type of setting. In fact, that's actually how this field got introduced to the field of public health by some of our colleagues who are emergency medicine physicians who started recognizing gun violence as an epidemic. So education and awareness are key, but some of the challenges to addressing these issues are these limitations that I've just mentioned. Additionally, public health is very political, as is everything else these days. There are a lot of polarized views on what should be done to address gun violence. This should be, people think it should be retained in the criminal justice system, in the legal system, and not necessarily spill over to health. A last challenge that I will mention is about federal funding. The United States has a really complex history when it comes to federal funding. This is largely due to restrictions that effectively halted funding through and from the Centers for Disease Control for gun violence research. This was over 2 decades due to the Dickey Amendment that was passed in 1996, which discouraged federal funding from being used to study gun violence. And that was very much due to the power of gun lobbyists. And we're seeing this so much too in our political landscape, including with the presidential election. It wasn't until the end of 2019 that Congress allocated $25 million towards gun violence research. That money has been divided equally between the National Institutes of Health and the Centers for Disease Control. Very promising. It's fantastic for us who rely on grant funding to do this research, but it's not enough. We definitely need more funding from philanthropists and others who will allow a lot more of the multifaceted, complex research that needs to be done to better understand the nuances of what is contributing to this issue, which truly is a public health crisis and epidemic. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I want to give the panelists an opportunity to comment on each other's presentations and maybe to say a few more words on these issues. But I'd also like to point out that so far we have focused on the United States entirely, but guns also affect our neighbors. President López Obrador of Mexico, where they have strict gun control laws, where there are only 2 places in the nation where guns can be purchased, complains that the vast majority of guns in Mexico come from the United States, especially Texas, where they are so easy to buy. And drug cartels have easy access to high-powered weapons, which have fueled violence in Mexico. The Mexican government, in fact, is suing U.S. manufacturers. There's a U.S. law that prohibits U.S. citizens from making such lawsuits, from bringing such lawsuits against gun manufacturers. But these laws say nothing about foreign governments, and it remains to be seen how that will play out. I also want to point out in 2021, the last year we have such data, 85% of guns found at crime scenes in Haiti traced to the United States. And in 2022, 98% of guns in Bahamas, mainly from Florida, where gun sales are lax and straw purchases are common. One exasperated Caribbean leader declared the flood of guns from the U.S. a direct threat to our democracy. He said, "The right to bear arms ought not to give them the right to traffic arms." That's Philip David, Prime Minister of the Bahamas. And that was 2 days ago in the Washington Post. Every single day that one reads the newspaper, we see these articles on gun policy, gun control, and gun violence. So I'm going to turn it over back to the panelists here, beginning with Brian, if you'd like to comment on any of these issues.
Yeah, thank you. Great presentations. I'll just, since I know we don't have a ton of time, I'll just quickly follow up on your excellent points about arms exports. I think one of the things that I'm most struck by and honestly frustrated by about our national conversation about firearms is how much passion there is in the country for everything to do with guns within the country, and how much kind of apathy, honestly, there is about anything to do with guns that leave our country. And it would be a problem anyway, but it's especially a problem because we are the great arsenal to the world. For the last 70 years, we have been the preeminent arms exporter to the entire world. And in fact, if you take out number 2 from the equation, that's the USSR, the Soviet Republic, then we, over the last 50 years, have exported more arms than the rest of the world combined. So we are uniquely figuring into the proliferation of arms around the world. And these figures don't even include the trafficking that we just heard about from Kevin. So it's an enormous problem in Mexico. It's an enormous problem in Haiti. To give another factoid, I read that in 2000, a survey in Haiti concluded that there were probably 500,000 guns in the country, and 38,000 of them are registered. The vast majority are coming from the United States. And so I think that one of the things I would love to see happen in my lifetime is the folding in to our domestic conversation about our role in arming the rest of the world. And there are I think actually it would be a lot easier for us to take meaningful steps to try to make that less of a bad problem than it is currently for us to do much about our domestic firearms situation.
You, Brian? Adam?
Isn't it great that everyone's buying American? I mean, that's what we really want, right? Keep the economy humming. Just a quick comment on each of my co-panelists' comments. First of all, with regards to Brian's discussion of the differences between the gun culture of today and the gun culture of yesterday, and he has his article that he's written. That's an excellent article. I highly recommend it. That this sort of myth of continuity in American gun culture and the history and tradition test that the Supreme Court is using and that the lower courts have employed since the Bruin case in 2022. has been all built around this myth, the idea that the gun culture was the same in the 1700s and 1800s. And so we look to the laws of those eras to try to figure out what government can do and what can't do. And it's problematic in part because it also not only rests on a mistaken assumption that historians are always fighting against, the idea that yesterday is just like today, that people thought about the issues just like we think about them today. But also because it's based on an understanding that government always regulates to the very boundary of its power. And if we look in the past and we don't see gun regulation, say banning domestic abusers from possessing firearms, that's itself a suggestion that the people of yesterday did not think that regulating guns was a good idea to reduce gun violence, when they just didn't think about it in these ways, that government just didn't have the institutional capacity it has today to be able to ban guns or to be able to have databases and sufficient enforcement mechanisms to make these things happen, to make these bans effective and useful. So that myth of continuity is, it means that the Supreme Court has turned to history, but it has not taken the primary lesson that every historian is taught and teaches, which is that context matters, and it's all about the context. And then with regards to Jennifer's excellent overview and analysis of the gun violence problem and the data that we have showing how gun violence affects us, well, none of that is relevant at all to the Supreme Court's determination under this text, history, and tradition analysis. None of it's relevant for whether a gun law is constitutionally permissible or not. Just doesn't matter. How many people die? How many people use firearms inappropriately? Where they use them inappropriately? Who's going to be victimized by those firearms? All that matters is what did the state of Massachusetts, how did they regulate guns in the 17 and 1800s? And so it's a very unusual way to think about constitutional law, and one only wonders whether the court's turn to hit what it calls history and tradition will be relegated to the Second Amendment, or will it start to expand and start affecting other areas of constitutional law? And if so, I think it'll be highly problematic.
Yeah.
I just have one quick comment. I actually want to follow up on your note about us limiting we're focusing on the United States. And from a global perspective, the majority of gun use mortality impacts children, and the numbers are huge. I apologize because I don't have these statistics offhand, but most of the firearm violence is related to conflict and other fighting, and it is a huge issue globally in terms of mortality among young people and civilians in warfare. So this is something we hear about on a daily basis now too. So it is certainly something that is not limited to the United States and warrants much attention from a global perspective.
Thank you, Jennifer. When I look at the Second Amendment, I study colonial Latin American history, so not United States history, but the same time period, 1791, is the period that I study. And I know from the history of Spanish America that there were prohibitions of people of color to have weapons, and that the state relied for more than 200 years on European males owning weapons to enforce their laws, basically. There wasn't a standing army created until much later, and that was to defend the territories against other European nations. When I look at the Second Amendment here, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, right? This is a time when the young United States did not have the money to fund a permanent paid army. They had to rely on militias if necessary, as Brian said, like the Minutemen, for example, during the Revolution. But now the old amendment seems obsolete because we don't need a well-regulated militia. We have one. It's called the United States Armed Forces. Right? If we're going to scrutinize history and use history as a criterion for interpreting these laws, then I think historians ought to be consulted. And that's why history matters. I want to thank our panelists for their expertise. Thank you. And I want to thank you, the audience, for turning out for this important discussion. Thank you so much. And we have refreshments outside in the back where we can continue this conversation if we'd like. Thank you.